What is going on with tariffs right now? What has happened? What has happened to our foreign policy conversation? Why is the Republican Party, its nominee, now asking for a 10% to 20% tariff on all goods imported to the United States? I don't know if you saw, last week he was talking about 100 to 200% tariffs on European imported goods. Europe is one of our main export markets. A trade war with Europe seems like it would be devastating for American car manufacturers. The same one he's saying he wants to, help up. It's going to be devastating for the American export markets that are, there's a big consumer base in Europe, consumer bases that don't necessarily exist on other continents.
So I think, first of all, the most important thing to understand about any of this kind of Trump proposal on tariffs is that one thing that Trump does understand very, very well is that people on the whole do not vote on the basis of policies. They vote on the basis of perceived values and who is going to kind of fight for them against whatever outgroups they've defined. So for Trump, the notion of slapping tariffs on like Europeans, on everybody, is an incredibly appealing formulation because the subtext is, listen, there are things that we as a nation want to pay for, and I am going to pay for them by taxing foreigners. This is his version, not reality, by basically punishing foreigners. And in doing that, I'm going to bring more jobs to the US. It's telling that he pairs a lot of this talk about charging very high tariffs with the idea of, for example, abolishing the income tax. So this idea of like, hey, you don't like taxes and you also don't love foreigners. I have a solution where we get rid of your taxes by just hurting foreigners. And like that's what's behind it. And it's not like about the economics of it. It's not like he's looking at the models and doing like weighted analysis. He's not doing gravity model analysis. He is looking for ways to tell a story about who he is, who he's fighting for, and who he's going to hurt on your behalf. It's like, I think that's really important to understand like straight away, because if you don't kind of recognize that, the temptation is to come at this argument with like academic economics and be just like, well, we know from an efficiency standpoint, Ricardo, yada, 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 yada. Nobody cares. You got to begin by kind of accepting what he's doing. I think that's really important to kind of flag. The second thing to flag is it's fucking insane. Like just on every kind of imaginable basis, it is an incredibly irresponsible and silly policy that just hurts the poorest people in America, hurts American competitiveness, and really kind of kicks the American economy in the nuts right when, by any conceivable metric, you guys are kind of crushing it and everyone else is on their knees. I can talk through why that is if people care. I realize you got 24 hours to fill, but I also recognize that most people would rather eat glass than listen to somebody talk about trade economics.
We can get into the specifics. Well, that's why I brought you here. This seems like your bread and butter. So thank you so much for the $10 donation. I appreciate that, buddy. This is going towards embeds. Okay, so the first thing I need to ask is there just do people just not know what a tariff is? Because I'm seeing all these clips now where podcasters are interviewing other people, or people are getting caught in high profile conversations, not knowing what tariffs are. And these are the people who are making content about tariffs. They're either making reaction videos or they're on these shows debating tariffs. And it's all being talked about in the idea that we place a tariff on the Chinese and then the Chinese pay it. They don't understand that you import the good, and those importing the good pay the tariff, the company and or person. They seem to genuinely believe that somehow between it crossing from their market to our market, they're paying it. They think there's like a toll booth in the middle of the ocean and the Chinese ship has to pay it in order to access like American law. That's not how it works. Is it an education problem? What's the problem?
I mean, as with a lot of things in trade, it's partially like a nomenclature branding problem. If we had called tariffs like taxes or even import taxes right from the
Harris
start,
has
which is
tried to
what
do.
they,
Harris is like saying it's a she said in effect sales tax is like the campaign speak they've been using.
yeah, and she's absolutely right to do it because people understand the notion of taxes. They understand the notion of sales taxes. My personal language for it is always it's a patriotism tax or a lack of a lack of patriotism tax. What I try to get people, like the way I ask people to visualize it is like you're standing at a supermarket, you're looking at a row of different options of what to buy, and you're doing the math on what to get, and you're looking at like, oh, I like this particular kind of food, but it's pretty expensive, I might get something else. One of the things that you may consider in making that choice is that product made in America? That might be more or less important to you. And you'll kind of factor that into your choice where you'll go, well, I'm willing to pay more for like an American avocado, but not like $3 more. And what a tariff is basically the government coming in, standing beside you and going, I don't trust you to be patriotic enough in this choice. So what I am going to do is tax you for making the wrong decision or for an unpatriotic decision. I'm going to artificially make it more expensive to buy non-American stuff because I don't trust you to, for yourself, decide that you want an American product over a different product. It's kind of that patriotism tax. It's the government getting in between you and the things and your perception of what is the best value thing to buy for your family.
So this conversation has taken on a new dimension, though, as Trump has talked about 100. So there's two things we want to talk about. The first one is what I've already mentioned: the 100 to 200% tariff on the Europeans. He throws these numbers, I believe, at random. I don't think these are like policy proposals that somebody has written up and given him in Trump world. I don't think Elbridge Colby or whoever is like giving him policy papers. I think he's just out there and he's sounding bullish, he's beating his chest, and he's just saying numbers at random. But it's impossible to know what he will and will not implement. Definitely when in the Trump era, decisions sometimes would be made in the middle of the night, like the withdrawal from Syria, without even talking to advisors. And assuming that he gives this as much thought as that, or he goes through with what he's saying, or the markets just react to the possibility of it happening, because that happens. What would happen if he placed 100 to 200% tariff on all goods from Europe entering the United States, like he threatened to do on the campaign trail?
Yeah, sure. So we can game this out. And like one of the things that makes this somewhat scary, or scarier than perhaps some of his other proposals, is that unlike, for example, getting rid of the income tax, the executive branch has a lot of tools to do this unilaterally. So Trump can just do this. There are tools in place that even if he doesn't control Congress, even if he doesn't have a veto-proof majority in the Senate, it's complicated to get into the kind of legalisms of this, but basically, he could do this. He could slap these tariffs in place.
So to be clear, if the Democrats kept the Senate today and won back the House, if we did not have a veto-proof majority, or like a veto-proof majority to stop him, then he could hypothetically implement these tariffs with or without the approval of Congress.
That's right. He'd have to do a little bit of legal gymnastics, and it would almost certainly face a court challenge, but he has a pretty friendly Supreme Court to review it, because it wouldn't require legislation, effectively. And if the Democrats kind of wanted to stop it, they would have to repeal kind of fairly foundational acts of Congress from before, like the 301 and 232. It doesn't matter. The point is, it would be pretty hard to stop him, and it would be they might be able to, especially if they get rid of the filibuster, undo something like that he did in time. But in terms of like the handbrake, there would be very few handbrakes on him doing this. So like the first thing to really understand is that if you are counting on the checks and balances of the US system to prevent Trump from going absolutely hog wild with tariffs, not going to happen. They're not as robust there as they are in some other places, so not great. But then, okay, let me kind of walk through.
So
what
just to be clear for viewers, that means if Donald Trump is the next president of the United States, no matter who the advisors are around him, no matter what the House and the Senate says, if Donald Trump decides that he wants to place these tariffs on these countries, he has general authority to do so. And so he can go forward with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of broadly true. Lawyers are going to argue about it, but that's a pretty solid summation. But then, let's talk about your hypothetical. So he slaps across the board tariffs of like 20 to 100% on everybody or on Europe. Immediately, that leads to a bunch of things. So first of all, obviously, European products basically just double in price. In practice, that will mean they disappear off shelves. Very, very, very few products can remain competitive at a 100% markup. So they would disappear. That kind of the withdrawal of them from the market would likely mean that the American products competing with them would go up in price because a bunch of competition would disappear. So that means a whole bunch of things that basically just means inflation in practice. The next thing that would happen is, we tend to think of trade as like the things we buy in shops, like business to consumer trade, but a huge, huge, huge percentage of what is traded across the Atlantic is components. So parts, things that go into the things that US factories make, and vice versa in Europe. So what you would see is immediately a whole bunch of US production that relies on specialist components from Europe suddenly finds the costs of making things go way up. That's just like inevitability. The US and European economies are pretty integrated. Their supply chains have bounced back and forth. So immediately you have US industries start to struggle to compete with things that are made elsewhere that don't have to pay these tariffs. Third thing, and we haven't gotten to the retaliation yet. So far, this is all just like the natural economic outcome. Third thing, you have an absolute feeding frenzy of lobbying, bribery, and corruption in Washington, D.C. as individual industries and like businessmen start making the case to Trump and to whoever his Treasury Secretary is going to be. It's looking like Bob Lighthizer, to basically get a carve out or an exemption from these tariffs. This is something that we saw with the US CHIPS Act under Biden. This is something that we've seen every time. So what you end up basically happening is all of these industries or businesses that rely on European products come glove in hand to the White House and see if they can get carved out. That's not great for democracy because those deals are going to be non-transparent, really transactional, and it's basically open license for people to bribe, figuratively and potentially literally, actors within the Trump administration. So that's also bad.
But this assumes that Donald Trump is, they would assume that he'd be a guy who would kind of grift off of his public office.
I know it's difficult to imagine that. I'm really asking us to push the limits of what our minds.
By the way,
conceive.
You can still get Trump trading cards and NFTs. They are still available on the market. New ones are still coming out. I've bought 20. I just, that's my personal investment recommendation.
Well, thank you for your service. A proud Marga Nation thanks you. So then that kind of gets to the fourth bit, which is during the first Trump administration, when the U.S. hit US hit Europe with tariffs, Europe wasn't institutionally set up to really respond all that well. The European Union is it can be quite a ponderous beast. Like, they can't just do stuff. They need to have established mechanisms, procedures, committees, authorities, acts of the European Parliament to, like, let them react in certain ways. And so when the first wave of Trump tariffs hit, they had to kind of jury rig a response using their anti-dumping and countervailing duty mechanisms and, like, basically just cobble together some sort of counterpunch by using other mechanisms to try to somehow swing back. Since then, they have established something called the Anti-Coercion Instrument and the Anti-Coercion Office, specifically to give themselves the ability to punch back just as hard the next time this sort of thing happens.
So you're saying the Europeans have prepared for this scenario, and if this scenario was to play out, they would have much more tools than last time to respond.
Absolutely. So they have literally prepared institutionally for this scenario. I'm not talking about, like, economically. They haven't, like, started stockpiling bourbon and Harley Davidson motorcycles or whatever. They've just put in place the, like, legal mechanisms they would need to, if they get punched, they punch back. And so they can quickly levy tariffs back against Trump's USA, and I think their voters will basically demand that their industry will demand that they do so. They are not going to put up with being unilaterally locked out of, like, a $500 billion market for them without at least demonstrating.
Because, like, all of this corruption, all of this quid pro quo that's going to be going on is also going to be wrapped in the American flag. It's going to be casted as patriotic. And so when these different steel companies or aluminum companies or, I mean, it could be really anything, that start, like, doing this wheeling and dealing, they can, like, paint it as, like, a patriotic effort of building American industry, when really it's going to be making American consumers pay more to only be given you as an option.
Absolutely. And it's kind of, there's basically two reasons that the Trump administration has given for imposing tariffs, and they're directly contradictory and both kind of dumb. So one argument is, hey, we're going to make a ton of money off this, like tax revenue. So basically, people are going to keep sending us stuff. We're going to charge them 20% to 100% of the price of whatever they send us, and we're going to make lots of money for the U.S.
I think you undersold it. To be clear, he's saying that these tariffs are going to be able to replace the income tax when it comes to revenue. This is what Trump is starting to say, which is getting the attention of people like Ron Paul and other people of more of the libertarian movement, and in this final gust towards the White House, as he starts offering more and more either handouts or massive unreciprocated tax cuts in the budget. I mean, it really tips the scale when it comes to, like, budget mismanagement, at least from all the projections I've seen from economists.
Yeah, and I mean, replacing income tax would require raising trillions of dollars worth of tariffs. From memory, I believe the U.S. imports like 3.2 trillion, 3.5 trillion dollars worth of goods every year. So you would have to, like, tax that at, like, 60% in order to raise, like, 2 trillion to try to replace income tax. The math doesn't really work there. But the other problem is it's, like, self-defeating. This is pure Laffer curve stuff. The higher you raise tariffs, the less people export to you, because their goods stop being competitive. And you don't raise any money off something someone didn't send you because the tariffs were too high. Like, if you could tax imports at 10,000%, and that would theoretically raise a lot of money, but no one is going to import a good with a 10,000% tax on it, so you actually raise zero. And that's the problem with a lot of his reasoning. As soon as you say we're going to have high tariffs, you're basically saying that's just going to cut the amount of imports way, 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 way down. And so you're not going to raise any money off it. To catch 22.
We haven't even mentioned the fact that a lot of these industries that America relies on, like for example, the automobile industry, they rely on imports. They rely on complex imports from other countries. And if you place tariffs on them, even if you don't have tariff on the car, and therefore you're trying to create a bubble, like a market, a bubble around your market domestically, if the goods they have to import increase in price because of the tariffs, then you've still passed the cost onto the consumer, just in a roundabout way.
Absolutely. And if you think about the logic of it as being like, okay, we don't care about that because what it will mean is factories move back to the US, right? Like that's logic. You kind of run into problems there too, because ideally the kind of factories that you want to build in the US are the ones where like you make stuff that you're good at making, because that's where your advantage is, right? But if you start slapping tariffs on everything, you instead just end up making the things that the economy critically needs because it can't get it anywhere else anymore. You kind of distort the entire market, and rather than building the industries of the future, we end up just making the things we have to get by. And I should say that, like, it's also just not clear what problem we'd be solving. The US manufacturing is doing really, really well. The chips factory that you guys have built in, I think, is it Nevada or Arizona, is now producing more efficiently than the TSMC factory in Taiwan.
Yeah, it has a higher yield.
So, yeah. So you guys are incredibly capable of building amazing factories. And you're doing it more and more because for a whole bunch of reasons, the US has a really good business climate right now, huge amount of capital, really good incentives from a combination of Biden policies and state and local policies. You're finally doing some stuff about regulations, especially in some of the southern states. So there's really positive momentum. At the same time, your unemployment is really low. And so there isn't like a huge pool of people who desperately want to go work at a factory. And also to the extent that like we're worried about, how do we bring back the blue collar Rust Belt jobs of the past, the kind of factories people build in America are not going to employ thousands of high school graduates with no further education. That's not the way American factories work anymore. American factories are all about high capital, high automation, and really highly skilled workers who are kind of programming robots using their computer science or computer engineering degree from MIT. It's not dudes turning wrenches anymore, and it never will be again. It just doesn't make sense to build factories that way in the US. So even to the extent that you're saying, we can bring back employment to like to the Rust Belt, not with factories, you can't.
All these libtards took away our jobs with their damn robots. Anyway, I love that Elon Musk fella. He seems like he's got a head on his shoulders. Where were we? Okay, there's two last things I wanted to cover before we wrapped up. The first thing is, Donald Trump says that if the US dollar was lost as the world reserve currency, then this would be like America losing a war. Number one, what would happen? And number two, how would these tariffs being placed on these imports and these imports, how would that affect the US dollar's world reserve currency status?
So there are kind of two different questions there. I think to an extent he would be right. I mean, it's hard to like compare it with losing a war. That comparison's kind of esoteric, but it would be very bad. The US dollar being the world's reserve currency and currency of currency that is used to trade is one of the reasons the US can borrow money very, very cheaply. And it keeps the value of the dollar up because countries all over the world, giant investment funds all over the world, and anybody who wants to kind of conduct international trade, they are constantly having to buy US dollars on the world market, right? Because if you want to, and that means in practice that they are buying US dollars, so they're driving up the value of the US currency, they are reinforcing the value of the US currency, and they're kind of affecting the US bond rate in useful ways. So that is like very, very important to the US. So it would be very, very bad if it happened. If the US starts locking out imports using tariffs, that makes the US currency a riskier proposition because it begs the question of what happens next. It also means that the US, because it would be importing much less, has to buy less foreign currencies, which has effects on the value of the US dollar, but that kind of gets well beyond my expertise as not an economist. And I should say, sorry, can I just clarify something I said earlier? Your chat's absolutely right that a lot of existing US factories still employ a lot of blue-collar workers. They will continue to do so. Those are legacy factories. What I was talking about was if you, through tariffs, triggered a new wave of new factory construction. So what I'm talking about is somebody like borrowing $1 billion from the bank to build a factory that they expect to produce returns for a decade. That factory is almost certainly going to be very, very heavily automated and rely on higher skilled workers. So it's not that like every factory in America is robots at the moment. It is the future of US manufacturing. That's where US manufacturing is going.
Okay, so I think we're going to be getting results soon because it's now past 7 p.m. on the East Coast. So the results in Georgia and North Carolina should be coming in the near future. So I wanted to ask you just one last policy-related question. Back on the idea of world reserve currency, like losing that status, which Trump has said would be like losing a war. How would eliminating the independence of the Fed, of the Federal Reserve, impact the U.S. dollar's status as the world reserve currency? Because Trump has suggested that the U.S. president should have more power and more influence over the decisions of the Federal Reserve.
I mean, extremely negatively is the short answer. One of the reasons that the U.S. currency is the global reserve is it is considered basically safe as houses. One of the funniest things to happen during the global financial crisis, and there were very few funny things that happened, so I guess it's a low bar to clear, is that the ratings agencies at one point like downgraded U.S. debt, and the reaction was the world markets freaking out and rushing out to buy U.S. debt. So basically, ratings agencies said, ooh, like US debt isn't as safe as it used to be. And everybody went, oh no, that's horrible news. I need to invest in something safe. I'm going to go buy a bunch of US debt. So like, and that is because basically like the US currency is the new gold. If you want something that will give you a modest, safe return where your money will still be there 10 years from now, you buy a T-bill, right? Because it is significantly less volatile and a lot more predictable than most other currencies out there. Certainly more than speculative assets like gold or crypto. So what that means is, if you hand over control over monetary policy, you take it away from an independent set of actors in the Reserve Bank and you hand it to a president whose primary imperatives are going to be like short-term political, not long-term like fiscal stability. and who will have priorities other than the Fed's one priority, which is keeping inflation to 2%. Like, keeping inflation at 2% is the one thing that the Fed focuses on. The president has a million other priorities. And so you're going to see that rate become a political football, which makes the US currency and US debt a less reliable, a less safe port in a storm. And you're going to see countries starting to move away from it, which would be bad for US hard and soft power.
I'm muted. Thank you very much for coming on today's show. I really appreciate it. And I know that everybody in chat that's as nerdy as we are also appreciated it. Any last thoughts? And would you like to plug your book again?
No, listen, Godspeed, good luck. Good luck staying up for 24 hours. It's gonna be a long run. Thank you so much for having me. My book, for whatever it's worth, is called Why Politicians Lie About Trade. It's just like me explaining trade stuff as accessibly as I possibly can, and trying to tell people what they should look out for when someone's lying about it. So yeah, good luck, and I hope you have something to celebrate in coming hours.
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much. And God willing, you'll be right. See you later, man.
Yep.
Bye. Oh boy. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, chat. What a chat. What a discussion.